Hey guys, welcome to another Striper season update brought to you by West Marine. We are in the first week of August right now. It's August 6th. We're just a couple days ahead of the new moon, and the August new moon tends to be a pretty good one. So the reports leading up to this moon have been so. The fishing's been pretty good off Montauk and off Block Island, some big bass being caught there. Cape Cod's been kind of slow. There are some fish in the canal, 15, 20 pounders, some fish 20 to 25 pounds hanging around Martha's Vineyard. It sounds like there are still some fish moving around the outer Cape if you can find them. Sounds like they're on sand eels. The bunker schools that were there last year haven't materialized yet, at least not from what I'm hearing. Further north, Boston Harbor is still a hot spot. There's been a lot of big stripers that have just hunkered down there since early July, and they seem to be in no hurry to leave. They seem to just be moving around that Boston up to North Shore area. So that is pretty much the striper fishing right now. I would expect to hear some great reports next week as this new moon comes and goes. The new moon is going to be the 9th, so we're just a couple days ahead of that. For this week's topic, I'm going to be talking about one of my very favorite lures, and that is the bucktail jig. Bucktail jig has been around for a very long time. One of the things a lot of guys like to say about it is that it is so effective that they take the bucktail jig and put it in survival kits of Navy pilots. So if they, or if they get stranded on a desert island, they'll use the bucktail jig to be able to feed themselves. I caught my first fish on a bucktail jig at Montauk Point, and up until that point, I'd been using bucktails, but hadn't had a lot of success with them. I first, before I got really into surf fishing for stripers, I did a lot of fishing for largemouth bass. So when I made that progression in the surf fishing and discovered the bucktail jig and pork rind combo, I thought of it a lot like the freshwater jig and pig. And that's kind of how I fish it. I would just bounce it along the bottom, work it the same way you would work, just a jig and pig in freshwater. Just let it bounce, keep it very slow, very low to the bottom. I didn't have a lot of success with that. It wasn't until I was at Montauk in the middle of a blitz, everybody around me is using bucktail jigs and hooking up. And this older surfcaster kind of took pity on me and said, look, kid, here, just cast it out there. Don't let it sink to the bottom. He said, just start your retrieve right away. Keep a steady retrieve. Give it a hop every 4 or 5 turns of the handle. And just like that, I started catching fish. And since then, it has been, I've probably caught more fish on bucktail jigs than maybe the rest of the striper lures I use combined. I've caught my very biggest striped bass on a bucktail jig. There are a lot of great bucktail jigs out there now. We've got kind of a custom tires who are tying jigs in a lot of colors, a lot of sizes. They've all got heavy duty hooks on them, perfect for striped bass. But the first kind of bucktail I caught a striper on, and the bucktail I caught my biggest striper on, was the Andrus Jetty Caster. And they're made by a man named Richard Andrus. He lives in Millville, New Jersey. And to this day, I think they're one of the best striper bucktails out there. Um, Almost 10 years ago now, I had the chance to interview Richard Andrus about his lure, the Andrus Jetty Caster, for a column in On the Water magazine, the Lure of the Month column, and got some pretty cool insights into how he developed that lure and how to work it. And I'll go into a little bit of that here. So as the name implies, it is a lure that's most often used by surf casters, the Jetty Caster. That lure has a bullet-shaped head, very dense bucktail hair, and a heavy-duty hook. The importance of that dense bucktail hair is that that's going to slow the sink rate of this jig, which makes it easier to keep it off the bottom, out of rocks, out of rockweed, so that surf fishermen are able to fish this in relatively shallow water. But Rich actually landed on that design not for fishing the surf, but rather for jigging with wire line. He had a trip booked with, at the time, a very famous captain, Captain Frank Sabatowski out of New Bedford, who fished aboard the June Bug. And if there's any striper historians watching this, you may recognize the name of the June Bug and of Captain Frank Sabatowski as the boat that took, and the captain that took Charlie Cinto out to catch his 73-pound striped bass on wire line and a Goo Eyes metal lip swimmer. But Frank caught a ton of big fish. He was very well known. Rich Andrus booked a trip with him, and Frank said, look, I'm out of bucktail jigs. Can you make me some bucktail jigs? So Rich did his best to kind of imitate the jigs he'd seen used on Frank's boat in the past. And had that bullet-style jig head, dense bucktail hair, and of course, a nice sturdy hook. The other thing that they used with their bucktail jigs was green pork rinds. They used strips of green pork rinds. So Rich took his jigs out with Captain Frank. They caught a ton of fish. And when Andrus went full time into selling lures in 1974, he was trying to, he saw the potential for this lure in the surf, but it took a while to catch on among surf casters. When surf fishermen at the time started fishing these bucktail jigs, they kind of ran into the same issue that I did. They were fishing them right along the bottom, jigging them up and down, taking the word jig literally and fishing it up and down like you would like on a boat. It wasn't until Andrus figured out that if he fished them the same way in the surf or a similar way in the surf that they were doing with wire line, that the jigs became incredibly more effective. And that key was keeping the jig moving, not letting it stop and fall, just giving it kind of a steady movement, steady retrieve. And that was, the key to making it work. He took those jigs to what, is and was and probably always has been the proving ground for lures in the surf, and that was Montauk Point. But at the time, Montauk, and Montauk still does have kind of a tough crowd of surf fishermen. But back then, it was even tougher because most of the guys in the surf were fishing for money. They were selling their catch. So they were even more secretive than they are today, when most of the guys are releasing the fish they're catching. It wasn't until Rich started putting on a clinic with these jetty casters that the guys started talking to them. He started getting them out there, and the word got out about the effectiveness of this lure. And, 20, 25 years later, you go to Montauk and every other guy has a jetty caster clipped onto the end of his line, catching fish, right under the light with them. The effectiveness of the bucktail jig, the jetty caster and a great variety of bucktails used by fishermen throughout the Northeast, is tied to using it with a trailer. And the best trailer and the most popular trailer up until 6 years ago was the Uncle Josh pork rind. So Uncle Josh is a lure company that's been around since 1922. It's coming up on 100 years old. And it was started because two guys, Urban Schreiner and Alan Jones, could not find any frogs. They were going to go fishing and they wanted to use live frogs for bait. That was the most popular bait option at the time. They weren't able to find any or catch any. So they had the idea of taking some fat back from a pig, carving that into a frog shape. And it worked really well. They ended up starting their own lure company. The word got out. It was very effective. And they named it after a comedian, Uncle Josh, who has kind of faded into obscurity, but his name lives on through this lure company. Now, in 2015, Uncle Josh decided they were no longer going to make pork products. They stopped. I called the company right when that came out and asked them, why was this happening? I was, begging because they were using them with bucktail jigs. That was my favorite lure combination. And they said, people are bringing, the farmers are bringing pigs to slaughter at an earlier age now, so that the product they were getting, the fatback, wasn't as thin, wasn't as tough, or as suitable for lures as it had been in the past. Also, it was becoming more expensive. It was becoming cost prohibitive to make baits out of this natural material, pork. Now, there are alternatives, of course, to pork rind. There is soft plastics. You can use soft plastic curly tails. Some people will take saddle hackle feathers, tie those onto the shank of the bucktail jig hook, and that gives a very natural fluid action. There have even been some pork rind imitations coming out. You've got fat cow jig strips, otter tails. All of these work, but it's tough to match the natural action of actual pork rind, just because a natural material is just going to have more fluidity in the water. It's going to move, even than the most supple soft plastic. A natural material is going to move a little bit, more naturally. So just a couple weeks ago, I was at ICAST, which is the International Convention of Allied Sport Fishing Trades. It's a gathering in Orlando every year where all the tackle companies, show off what's new and exciting coming out the coming season. And I saw a big banner that said, "Pork is back." And that was the Uncle Josh booth saying that they were bringing the pork rind back. Now, next year is going to be the centennial anniversary for Uncle Josh, and I guess in recognition of that, they were bringing back some of the baits. So I beelined for that booth, and was a little bit disappointed to see that they were only bringing back some freshwater styles. I asked the people at the booth if they were bringing back some of the saltwater ones. The people there weren't clear. They weren't sure if they were going to bring them back. But then I did hear through the grapevine that we can look forward to some Uncle Josh pork rinds coming back, especially that 70S style, which is the one that most striper fishermen, not most striper fishermen, there were a couple different styles that the striper fishermen like. The 70S was kind of the straight pennant. There was also a fork-tailed one that a lot of guys liked. I like that 5-inch 70S version. That I used that in red and yellow primarily. On dark nights I would use the red, bright nights I'd use the yellow. They had a whole variety of colors, but those two I thought were kind of the staples. But since Uncle Josh stopped making pork rinds in 2015, there have been a couple other companies that popped up and began making pork rinds. You have Squeal and Reels and Osprey Custom Baits, and both of those you can buy online or you can buy at some tackle shops. And those have been good. They haven't been the shapes of them haven't been as consistent, at least with the Ospreys, as the Uncle Josh. They're great baits. They catch a lot of fish. But the Uncle Josh, I mean, they had such a big operation there of churning out the pork rinds that they had everything. One Uncle Josh pork rind looked just like the other ones. You see some inconsistencies in some of these smaller batches. And one of the other things you see with them too is that they don't hold the color quite as well. And that was one of the things that Schreiner and Jones had the most difficulty with, was finding a way to get the color to stay on the fat back, on the pork, so it could hang on there long enough to catch a couple fish. So that was something that Uncle Josh Lure Company figured out over the years, and that I'm sure these newer, smaller batch pork rind companies are going to continue to figure out as they continue to produce more. But ending the little history lesson there on Bucktail jigs, or at least Andrews jetty casters and Uncle Josh pork rinds, the way to fish these lures, and the way I think of fishing these lures, is bucktails are kind of precision instruments. So if you have a topwater plug like a pencil popper, that's a lure that's working across the surface. It's going to attract a striper from a distance. It's making big commotion. A fish is going to see that and chase it down. Now, a bucktail jig, I'm looking for that. If a fish sees it, may very well chase it down. But I think bucktails are most effective if I have somewhere where I know a striper is sitting. And because when you have a good bucktail jig that's got dense hair, it's going to sink slowly or sink at a controlled rate. I can pretty precisely know where my jig is swimming in the water column and get it to the place where I think the striper is sitting. So that's especially true in current. If I have an area where I know there's a big boulder that bass sit, on either side of or just behind, I can cast up current of that, and just by getting the feel for working a bucktail, get that to sweep so close to the boulder that I'm going to put it basically right in the face of the fish that are sitting there. And that's how I think bucktails are the most effective, is by just getting them in front of the fish. Because once the fish sees it, you have the natural kind of pulsing of the bucktail hair, you have the fluttering of the trailer, and it's a very lifelike presentation. And it's one that the bass don't have to work very hard to catch. They just kind of open their mouth, suck it in, and that is one of the most effective ways to catch not only numbers of stripers, but big striped bass. Now, depending on where you fish, the depth, the current, the type of bottom structure will affect what size bucktails are best. One of the kind of the standard size, and this probably goes from it being one of the best sizes for Montauk for a lot of conditions there, is the 1.5 ounce size. Now, I usually start with the 1.5 and adjust accordingly. If I need to go as high as 2.5, 3 ounces, I will. If I have to go lighter to 1 ounce, 3/4 of an ounce, maybe on a sand beach or in a shallow back bay, I'll do that. But the starting point for me is always 1.5 ounces. That seems to be like the standard size that'll cover a huge variety of places. And then, deeper water, faster water, you want to go heavier. Shallow, slower water, you want to go lighter. And in terms of colors, again, the white bucktail jig is probably the standard, but you'd be remiss not to have chartreuse with you. I like chartreuse and yellow on bright full moon nights. I call that the lemon lime combination. If it's a bright night, that chartreuse with the yellow trailer is deadly effective. It's going to be more effective than white and red, more effective than yellow and red. It just seems to be such an eye-grabbing color for the stripers that they see it in those bright nights. Darker nights, I'll go with a black bucktail and red trailer. And every night, regardless of the conditions or daytime, I'm using a white bucktail and sometimes trying that with a uh, red trailer, sometimes trying it with a yellow trailer. During the day, I tend to lean toward a yellow or white trailer on the bucktail jigs, with a white jig. Sometimes I'll try the red, but I like the lighter presentations in brighter days, brighter conditions, lighter colors, darker days, darker nights, darker colors. That seems to be one of the. It doesn't always hold true, but it's a good place to start for bucktail jigs. Bucktail jigs can be effective all season long. I mean, wherever you have moving water and stripers, there's a good chance you're going to be able to catch them on bucktail jigs, whether it's in the surf, whether it's trolling them on wire line, or in some places they even use them on three-way rigs, especially that's popular off the North Fork of Long Island. Some of the deep rips out there, where they will send a bucktail and trailer to the bottom. Behind it, you've got a big sinker here, three-way swivel to the jig itself, and they drift that. And that has been a very effective and very popular technique in some of the deep rips out there for years. But as I said, bucktails work all season long, but I especially like them in the fall. For some reason, that just seems like they are perfect for the fall and spring migrations. In the summertime, this time of year, it seems like bass are a little bit more, kind of in a less aggressive mood. So this is the time of year to go to live bait, chunk bait, use eels, use bunker chunks. Sometimes you get that out early in the morning, you'll see some fish on top. You can throw some top waters. But as things start to get cool off, you've got the bait. They'll start to group up, school, drop out of the bays. The stripers will start to school up and start to head south. That's when the bucktail jig really shines. So I'm sure you already have bucktail jigs, and even though they've been around forever, they are just as effective as they've always been. And try to think of them in the way that you're not casting and retrieving that, just trying to get a bass to chase it down. Use the bucktail. Think about where the striper is sitting, and then use that jig to get the lure right in the striper's face. I think stripers are. I don't think they're always that picky. I know they can be very finicky. I know we've all seen blitzes where stripers are on small bait and they'll refuse everything. But I think for a striper that's set up in an ambush position in structure and current, I think fish is in a very opportunistic mode, and that just putting something natural looking with a good action right near it in its proximity, got a good shot of getting bit. So thanks for checking out this week's striper season update. As always, we're going to be putting out another one next Friday. I think we'll have some better striper reports next week as this new moon comes and goes. August is always a great month, and I think August is the month when the fall run actually starts to materialize. Maybe we'll talk about that next week or the week after. Anyhow, thanks for checking this out, and talk to you later.